George and Harold's grades in school were much like whales in the ocean. They rarely rose above sea level. Melvin Sneedley, however, always got straight A's. Because Melvin was so academically gifted, people just assumed he was a lot smarter than George and Harold. But that wasn't true. You see, George and Harold were every bit as smart as the straight A students, but in a different way, in a way that couldn't be measured by quizzes or worksheets. Maybe George and Harold couldn't spell very well or remember their multiplication tables. Perhaps their grammar weren't no good neither. But when it came to saving the entire planet from the nasty forces of unrelenting evil, there was nobody better than George Beard and Harold Hutchins. I know that's a very bold statement to make and a rather silly sounding one, but if you just hear me out, I'd like to get across why I believe that statement to be true. Captain Underpants is a book series that I keep returning to. Doesn't matter what other books I've read over the years, I do have other favourite books, as you can see here. But Captain Underpants, I feel as if I cannot live without the most. The books were created by Dave Pilkey. When he was young, he was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD, and he was very frequently sent out of the classroom to his own private desk in the hallway, where he would create comics based on Captain Underpants and sell them to his friends in the playground. Despite appearing to be aimed at kids, they are a lot more thought out than I think they get credit for. The characters are memorable and well-defined. Pilkey's writing techniques encourage young readers to become self-aware. But above all of that, I believe Captain Underpants explores and promotes what it means to be an effective problem solver. My aim right now is to explore what I think makes the books function so well, which I will do through the first installment and my 2 or 3 other favourites. Now, I've got to stress that this is my interpretation. Whether or not any of this was Pilkey's intention, I have no idea, so don't take what I'm saying as an absolute. Let's begin. The Adventures of Captain Underpants, the first installment, I think sets the baseline formula for the series rather well. What is immediately noticeable is Pilkey's choice to write in the second person. It makes it feel like he's guiding the reader across the story and not just describing things and leaving it at that. I admit this isn't the most subtle way of getting information across, and I confess that Pilkey's writing style at this point isn't the most vibrant. It gets better with each installment, I think. But it does feel inviting, so much more so than if he just stuck rigidly to the third person. Right out of the gate, I think George and Harold are well-established characters. George is the more assertive one who comes up with the ideas, and Harold is along for the ride to help bring them to life. We learn at the beginning that they like to make comic books in their treehouse in their downtime, with their greatest creation being Captain Underpants. The joke is that while most superheroes look like they're flying around in their underwear, this guy actually is flying around in his underwear. It seems like a silly idea, but I think it showcases Pilkey's ability to make something unique out of the most minimal elements. And this is a motif I've noticed throughout the entire series as well. Like, many of the settings are dull everyday places, like a school or a city or a supermarket, but Pilkey is able to bring them to life in the most unexpected ways, I think. The comics that George and Harold make are always made into chapters within the story. Now, I think these styles of chapter work for 2 reasons. I mean, firstly, they aren't drawn very well, and they contain several grammar mistakes, which, in contrast with the more formal narrative text and the more proficient in-universe illustrations, I think help readers to adequately distinguish between correct and incorrect forms. It also helps to make George and Harold more relatable, because if you're someone who's struggling to read and write, you can still see yourselves in them. And that's another thing as well, that even though George and Harold are the protagonists and they always end up saving the day by the end of each book, they're not treated like prodigies all the way through. In fact, very early on, they pull off a series of pranks at their school's big football game, which ends up making people irritated. Also prominent to the story is the character of Mr. Krupp, their principal. He catches George and Harold on tape setting up all their pranks that they pulled off at the game, and he threatens them with a series of tasks and says, if you don't do all these, I'm going to send this footage to the football team and you're going to be in big trouble. He blackmails them, essentially. It's very clear that the only thing Mr. Krupp is interested in when it comes to George and Harold is asserting himself, of just showing off his dominance. And as we see in the later books, this is something that he and the other teachers seem to actively enjoy. I mean, yes, George and Harold did a bad thing, but the way Mr. Krupp goes about dealing with it takes a toll on their well-being and just makes them want to get out of school. What I think the best comedy films do is that, even though they are supposed to make you laugh, they either treat the subject matter seriously or scenarios still play out in a realistic way. And Captain Underpants is no exception to that. When George and Harold hypnotize Mr. Krupp into becoming Captain Underpants, it starts off as a joke, but it is immediately played straight. He jumps out the window to go and fight crime, George raises the possibility that he could be killed, he nearly gets arrested, and they happen to stumble across a villain who almost succeeds at blowing up the moon. In fact, every subsequent installment features a foreword which makes this point, that hypnotizing Mr. Krupp started out as a joke, but then it got carried too far. I even think this aspect of the story is enhanced by one of the later books. So book 9 is set in an alternate timeline where Mr. Krupp gets fired before the events of the first book. So because he's not around to be hypnotized into becoming Captain Underpants, all of the villains from the first 3 books succeed at taking over the world. And it makes you realize that if George and Harold didn't get distracted, things would be a lot worse. Another thing I think is worth bringing up is that the stories very often place a focus on their itinerary. Before they go out to pursue Captain Underpants, they gather essential supplies such as their skateboards and slingshots. In the second book, they make a slingshot out of underwear and cafeteria food. And at the beginning of the fourth book, we learn that George knows how to rewire a light switch so that it turns on a ceiling fan at the same time. What you may have noticed by this point is that the books contain illustrations. And just like Pilkey's style of writing, I think they do get better with each installment. But as of now, there is a very charming simplicity to them. In fact, the end of chapter 12 features my favourite illustration in probably the entire series. As George and Harold jump out the window to pursue Captain Underpants, they're juxtaposed against the school building where all of the students inside are facing away from the outside world. And the school building is portrayed in grey tones, and George and Harold jumping out the window is slightly more bright, as if to emphasize that, okay, there's a problem going on out here, and everyone inside the building is being kept in the dark about it. This book also introduces a recurring gag of a little boy seeing the predicament involving Captain Underpants unfolding, and when he tells his mother, she doesn't believe him while she's reading an equally bizarre sounding headline or book. Ultimately, The Adventures of Captain Underpants lays the groundwork for the series very well, while also standing on its own merits. There's some brilliant character dynamics going on that are very realistic, there's a nice balance between the jokes and drama, and there are plenty of sight gags for readers to pick up on, in addition to the main story. After 2 more books, and a hilarious 4th one, Pilkey writes Wrath of the Wicked Wedgie Woman, which I can best describe as the best book in the series so far. It starts out like business as usual. It introduces George and Harold, establishes they get bored easily and they let their imagination run wild. But unlike before, he used this as an opportunity to introduce their main teacher, Ms. Ribble. We learn very early on that she is retiring, and as she forces the children to write happy retirement cards for her, as she barks more and more orders, she gets noticeably more withered. And this isn't even just down to the illustrations, but rather the adverbs Pilkey chooses to use. But even then, he manages to slip in like a very subtle sight gag at the bottom of the double-page spread. After George and Harold decide to make a comic for her instead, they're sent to Mr. Krupp's office, where Miss Anthrope tasks them with handing out the Friday memo, but she leaves her computer on, and they both make some major modifications. Howard also tricks Mr. Krupp into marrying Miss Ribble, as you do. This then culminates in one hilarious school week, which is a fun slapstick sequence, but it also brings attention to the stress it's causing to the teachers. This all culminates in the wedding sequence when, after Mr. Krupp reveals George and Howard trick them, Miss Ribble chases them down, and it's one of those things where, okay, it is a funny sequence, but then if you actually stop to think about it, it is a little disturbing how stressed she truly gets. I think out of all the Captain Underpants books, this one will appeal the most to adults as well as children, because it's got these fun sequences, but it's underpinned by an admittedly serious story. It is generally well written as well. Each sequence builds upon the next one without feeling too forced or too lengthy, in an organic way. And Miss Ribble even gets redeemed at the end, rather than being sent to jail like the other villains. But as much as I think Pilkey hits his stride with Wrath of the Wicked Wedgie Woman, it was outdone by one other, or should I say two others. Out of all the books in the series, I find the Big Bad Battle of the Bionic Booger Boy has the most to say in terms of social commentary. Well, except for maybe the finale. I may as well talk about both parts in this section because they are more or less of the same quality and they are the same story. Melvin Sneedley is hands down the most intriguing antagonist in the series. When he's introduced in the Demonstration Day chapter, he initially comes across as a kid who just wants to get his work done with a minimum of fuss. So like the previous human villains, Pilkey does try his hardest to make him as sympathetic as possible. And there's nothing particularly wrong with just wanting to get your work done with no fuss. But the chapter does go on to demonstrate the difference between him and George and Harold, in particular their intelligence types. For his demonstration, Melvin creates something called the Combinotron 2000, which he demonstrates on his pet hamster Sulu and a bionic endoskeleton to create the world's first bionic hamster. The next thing he does is try to demonstrate how obedient he can be, and when he fails to do that, he whinges and complains that he doesn't want to see Sulu again. George and Harold, on the other hand, opt to take care of Sulu, and they teach him a skill that ends up paying off in the second book. Now, I don't know if I can speak for every culture out there, but I am going to for the UK. See, when the Victorians first established the education system in the 1800s, it's been long suspected that it was secretly a means of enhancing control among the population. Schools put more emphasis on their codes of conduct over the quality of their resources. They mix classes based on target grade and different abilities, and everybody assumes everything boils down to results. So essentially, every subsequent generation has been conditioned from a formative age to prioritize status and conformity, and it's often at the expense of knowledge acquisition. The knock-on effects of this is that we end up with people like Melvin Sneedley, Peter Hitchens, or Rishi Sunak. And that is people who are good at pleasing their institutions and doing what they're told and falling in line, but not so good at responding to real-time crises or understanding things that initially seem unfamiliar or unusual, or reading into complicated emotions or resolving interpersonal conflicts. Another trait of Melvin's I find really curious is that he's able to build a robot in a single evening, and we learn in the second book that it takes him a couple of days to build a time machine, as you do. But as we see, he's clearly just doing this to flex his own ego. Then the second book, when he ends up swapping bodies with Mr. Krupp, he just uses the situation to his advantage to just, obtain dominance over George and Harold instead of pursuing Mr. Krupp, who now thinks he's Captain Underpants, in Melvin's body. Conversely, Captain Underpants, the character himself, is shown to be quite selfless. When Melvin turns into a monster, Captain Underpants tries to rescue Misanthrope from his grasp, and he has to untie his cape, which gets stuck, in order to save her. And Pilkey makes this point on him sacrificing his aesthetic integrity in order to save her. And in the second book, when the Robo-Boogers attack the airport, he runs towards the airport, even though he's lost his superpowers, and George and Harold decide to join him rather than giving in to Melvin's demands. And like Wicked Wedgie Woman, it is generally well written. There are a lot of satisfying setups and payoffs. Sulu spanking Melvin is foreshadowing for their battle at the end. George and Harold establish this prank in their demonstration during the Demonstration Day chapter, which ends up paying off in the second book. And when Melvin turns into a monster, all Mr. Krupp and Misanthrope do to try and calm him down is to threaten him with a detention. So you could infer that that's where Melvin picked up his techniques from during the Demonstration Day chapter. Part 2 even makes a reference to book burning. When Melvin is looking for a quiet place to build his time machine, he comes across the library, and we learn that there's only one book to check out. So what is it that makes the Captain Underpants books secretly genius, as I claim? I say secret because while the books appear to be aimed at children, Pilkey isn't afraid to incorporate themes that pertain to real life, which adults can appreciate and kids can pick up on for themselves. Reverend Wilbur Awdry, the author of the Railway series, has made an excellent point that when you write a children's book, you're not just writing it for children, but you're writing it for other people as well. You're writing it for yourself to make sure it's been researched correctly, and you're also writing it for the parents who have to read it to their children time and time again. So it's very important to incorporate really subtle things that will keep them engaged as well. So I think in that regard, Captain Underpants and the Wrath of the Wicked Wedgie Woman is a perfect children's book, because it contains action sequences and slapstick sequences, which I really enjoyed as a kid and I still enjoy today. But it's pinned down by a rather serious story about a teacher who's getting stressed easily. And remember when I said the Captain Underpants books promote effective problem solving? Well, I think the big bad battle of the Bionic Booger Boy gets that point across the most effectively, which is mainly down to the contrast between George and Harold and Melvin Sneedley. While Melvin is only interested in pleasing the school, getting a grade, and flexing his own ego, George and Harold actually go out of their way to care for the people around them and teach one of them a skill that ends up paying off. The other thing these two or three books do really well is that they convey their themes through the characters. You see, I think the key to successful communication is being able to convey a lot of complex ideas and emotions at once, and in such a way that the audience isn't forcing themselves to be consciously aware of them. I admit the last 5 books have this small problem where Pilkey wants to make a strong point, which admittedly the points he makes in the last 5 books are good points, but it feels like he's grinding the story to a halt in order to get them across. Whereas in these 2 or 3, he conveys them through the characters, which not only enables him to convey it more subtly, but he does so in a way that it doesn't disrupt the narrative flow. In conclusion, I would recommend Captain Underpants to anyone.